جسدي مدنسا الآن وكل أوان وإلى دهر داهر إن سهلي لمناهي جاء الخلاص يا والدة الإله لأني قد دنست نفسي بخطايا سامجة وأفنيت عمري لكن بشفاعتك نقيني من كل يا رحيم ارحمني يا الله بحسب عظيم رحمتك وبحسب كثرة رأفاتك أمحو مآثمي إذا تصورت كثرة أفعالي رديئة أنا الشقي
resurrection. In Orthodox theology, really, it's just synonymous with theosis. Now, theosis is the doctrine of the deification of man, and that may sound strange to a lot of people, especially in the West, because they probably think that means something New Agey or apotheosis or something out of the occult. But actually it's not. It's really the biblical tradition itself. And so if you look back to Genesis in the garden, man was put into a very blessed state, but we would say that it was also temporary in a kind of probationary state. So when man fell, Adam was functioning as what we could biblically call a covenantal head, in that he stood for all of his representatives, all of his progeny to come. And a covenant is really just the idea of how God relates to man in the scriptures. So when Adam broke the divine law, what he did was he separated himself from communion with God. And what this did was it introduced corruption, passibility, and so forth, death into his lineage and into his descendants. And because man was put into dominion over creation, that death and corruption then extended to affecting all of the universe. So essentially all the universe partakes of this negative state of being, or this entropy, we might say, or this what Paul calls corruption in Romans 8. And so the whole creation stood in that relationship to Adam, and then Adam brought that state of moving away from the good and towards negation, towards death, towards non-being, and so forth. This is the way that the church fathers speak about what it means to have death as a privation and corruptibility as privation and so forth. And Adam was a type of Christ. And in the same way that Adam represented all of his descendants, so Jesus, or the Logos, represents before the Father all of his descendants, right? All of his progeny, which ultimately involves the restoration, the transfiguration of the entire cosmos, not just human nature. So in the crucifixion, what happens is that God the Father sends the Son, because the Son is divine, he's a divine person. He has the ability and the power to destroy the power of death. And this is what Paul says in First Corinthians, that the last enemy to be destroyed is death. And that is accomplished definitively in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. This is the pretty much consistent Eastern teaching, the idea of recapitulation. So if you go and read St. Irenaeus against the heresies, he'll talk about the doctrine of recapitulation, that Christ recapitulates everything that Adam brought death and destruction upon. So when Christ took on humanity, he lived all of the stages of humanity, right? He was a child, he was young, he became a fully grown man, and then he experienced death and resurrection, right? So he's been through all the possible stages of humanity, and that's how he's able to redeem a person at any stage in humanity. Strictly speaking, the resurrection then is the doctrine of our actual bodies that we have, that we were given, being raised up for all of eternity. And obviously, to be put into a better state of being to where it's not subject to corruption. And we know this because this is what happens after Jesus is resurrected. He walks around at the end of the Gospel of John, and he's talking to the disciples, and he has the same body that he had beforehand. And that's why Thomas puts his finger in the side, because he notices the same wound. So the resurrection of Christ becomes the archetype or the pattern for everyone else's resurrection. And how we live in this life will then determine how we experience the afterlife. The experience of that as blessedness only happens contingent upon whether or not we are truly united to Christ. And that happens through faith, and then through faith it brings about the works that we engage in to God's glory, obviously, which are done by grace. But that is theosis. Theosis is participating in the divine nature, and that's why Peter says this in 2 Peter. He says that we become partakers in the divine power, the divine nature. And how do we do that? We do that by theosis, right? This is the doctrine of theosis, and theosis is resurrection. So we participate already now in that glorification, Paul says in his epistles. And that glorification then results in the final state of resurrection and transfiguration. So what you see, for example, in Jesus on Mount Tabor, when he's transfigured, that is the divine energy radiating forth from him, right? Because he is the Son of God. And so when he took fallen human nature upon himself, he deified it. This is the teaching of the Eastern Fathers, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa. It's also the teaching of the councils in terms of The way Ephesus talks about the Eucharist, what the Eucharist is very similar to the incarnation, right? It's the deification of created matter, of creation, a body thou hast prepared for me, David says as he prophesies the incarnation of the Messiah. So all of this is, in summation, what the doctrine of the resurrection is, and it really should be understood in terms of Orthodox theosis. Look at John 17, where Jesus says that he came to give to his followers, to his disciples, the very life that he has with the Father. And that life is immortality, it's eternality.
Αγνή παρθένε δεσποινα, αχράντε Θεοτόκε. Υψηλότερα ουρανών, ακτίνων λαμπροτέρα. Εκλαμπροτέρα ουρανών, φωτός καθαροτέρα. Των ουρανίων στρατιών, πασών αγίοντέρα. Μαρία η Παρθένε, κόσμου παντός Κυρία. Μαρία νύμφια ανάσα, χαράς ημών αιτία. Τιμιωτέρα χερουβίμ, υπέρ ενδόξωτέρα. Των ασωμάτων σεραφείμ, των θρόνων υπερτέρα. Χαιρετώ άσμα χερουβίμ, χαιρεϊνός αγγέλων. Αντιλαβού μου ρίσε με από